back to RamDragon's Art Studio, soon to be renamed, as soon as Google will let me. That's RamDragon's Art and Games. My last video wasn't very good with the sound, so I'm trying something different here. I've got a little booth that I've slapped together, and unfortunately it's too small for a chair, but the sound quality in here should be really good. So what I've got going now is this is going to be a speed paint of a dragon. And in case you're interested in the overall time that this took to draw, it was altogether a little over 8 hours. But unfortunately, that included a period of time where I forgot I was recording and went and ran errands out of the house. So I'm not sure after I cut that long stretch out, you won't see that. I did cut that out. And I didn't see how long that was before I cut that out. I'm sure I have the original video somewhere and I can look that up and find out. But it was like 2 hours or something that it was. So this speed paint might have only been about 6 hours altogether. But I've sped it up 600%, so you don't have to sit through all of it. And right now, I am doing a sketch layer. I am using Krita 4.1.1, I believe. I'll put the exact version down in the notes below. But first thing I did, you saw me play a little bit with some settings. There is an animation setting in this new version of Krita that I'm really excited about, and I'll experiment with that later. But first thing I do when I do any kind of digital drawing is, create a background layer and lock it so that I can't accidentally draw on it. Create a second layer for the sketch, and that's where I'm drawing right now. And I'm just laying out some of the groundwork lines. You saw me create the head with the circle tool. That's actually a new technique that I started using because I haven't used my digital tablet in, oh man, it's been many, many years. One of the things I talked about in my Minecraft video that you couldn't hear, you probably couldn't hear it, and if you actually sat through the whole thing, congratulations, you're probably the only person who did. But one of the things I talked about was the fact that for the last few years I've been doing a lot of IT work, and as a result of pursuing my certifications in IT, I haven't really been doing a lot of artwork on my own. Now, I've always left myself open to do some freelance work. Just for the last, I don't know, 6 or 8 years, I haven't really done any freelance work at all. So I did a little bit of freelance work right after college and got really ripped off by the client, unfortunately, and I'm still steamed about that, but it makes me a little more timid on making bids and going out and finding work, which I do very rarely now. But for the last 9 months or so, I've been pretty much exclusively looking for freelance work. I shouldn't say exclusively. I've been job hunting as well. But I look back and I realize I really need to do my art. I haven't done art. I haven't concentrated on art in such a long time. But my background is in animation. I have a degree in media art and animation. And I've done fine art since I was 15. I started working in a professional artist's art studio as an apprentice. Um, one of the greatest experiences of my childhood. I really enjoyed that tremendously. It was a chance I had that I didn't really understand at the time how valuable and rare that was. But looking back now, I can't believe that I had that opportunity. But I did learn from him. I learned how to airbrush, and I learned a lot of art business techniques that unfortunately I was too short-sighted to implement. So instead of being an artist all these years, I've been doing a lot of other things. And, IT was originally something I did to pay the bills, but when it came down to it, I was spending a lot of time trying to be better at IT so I could pay more bills, and just spent too much time on that and didn't do any art. So right now I'm sketching in a background layer, and you can see I created a separate layer for the background sketch. And I'm just doing large brushes right now. I've done a few. You can see a little bit of little tiny sketching I did. Those are just guidelines that I put in so that I kind of have an idea of where I'm going. And right now I'm doing the broader strokes. Uh, Sketching in some windows. Now in the final product, what I'm going to use for the thumbnail is a more finalized picture, and you'll see there are no windows. There are no windows behind that dragon. I don't know whose accent that was, but it sure was not mine. But using the broad brushes gives me an opportunity to really set in early on how I kind of want the background to look. And I do a little bit of that sometimes with the foreground characters. There's a technique I learned from what book was that? How to Draw the Marvel Way, which I own, as well as How to Draw the DC Way. And both of those books are good for what they are, but they're not. You're not going to be a professional if those are the only art sources uh, you ever reference. There are a lot of art techniques out there, and what I'm using right now is definitely a more general technique that I learned while learning how to brush, learning how to paint with oils, setting in large areas of color. Um, when I draw with charcoals, that's definitely one thing that I do. I just block in large areas of shadow first, and then I start to turn my charcoal sideways to get a finer point and get more specific, and then turn it a little bit more to make a finer line and get more specific, and just until I'm finally drawing the details and erasing highlights and things like that. So now you can see I'm going back to my sketch, but on yet another layer, I'm creating my outlines. And you saw me play with brushes a little bit just to see how fine I can make the point and still get a uh, a really lively brush. My tablet, I do have a Wacom tablet. It's a Wacom Intuos 4. It is an older tablet. It's one that I had while I was in school, which I graduated in 2009. So this tablet is definitely, I've had it for 10 years or more. And I used it frequently while I was in school. I used it for almost everything. I loved that thing. But like I said, I haven't picked it up in a long time. Still kind of getting back into the feel of it. You can see some of my lines aren't very refined. And I keep going back and forth trying to make a better line. I've got to get that feel, that technique back. And that's really why I wanted to do this drawing. I really need to get that experience back, back into drawing all the time. And this is much, much more ambitious of a drawing than I've tried in a very long time. I do a lot of character drawing, a lot of character design when I'm sketching on my own. And I don't typically do background stuff. Now, I mentioned the art studio that I worked in before all those years ago. And by all those years ago, I'm talking about early 90s, guys. I'm an old guy. but but back then, I worked with a guy named Rob Pryor in his art studio in Toledo, Ohio. And it was just a fantastic experience. I learned so much from Rob that I unfortunately never implemented. And one of the pieces of advice he gave was, if you want to be a professional artist, go to college. Do not get a degree in art. Get a degree in business. And looking back now, I really, really, really wish I had heeded that advice, because I now, with the benefit of hindsight, I can look back and I can see that there's a lot of business opportunities I've had that I did not take up, and I really would have benefited tremendously from a business degree. But instead, I chose to go to an art school. I spent way too much money on a degree that is basically useless. I can't use it. So I'm going to pass this advice along to you guys. Seriously, if you're planning on being an artist, you want to be a professional artist, you want to work for yourself, definitely definitely 100% do like Rob Pryor. get a get a business degree with a minor in art. Do not get an art degree. I suppose even an art degree with a minor in business would be great, but understanding the business world is really um, is really what would have been beneficial, particularly for me, and I would say for everybody else. Now, the thing with Rob Pryor, he, I'm sure some of you guys are furiously looking him up to find out who this guy is. He might sound familiar to some of you people. He might not. But Rob was kind of a unique artist. Is kind of a unique artist. And at the time that I was working with him, he uh, boggled my mind that he would do these incredibly large paintings. Well, not incredibly large. I mean, we're talking about maybe twice poster size at the biggest. He worked on, while I was working in his studio, he worked on a couple of book covers for a Star Trek novel series for Voyager novels, and he worked on some comic book covers for Marvel, and he worked on a movie poster that ended up being circulated in some region in Canada for the Judge Dredd movie, the first Judge Dredd movie, the one that had Sylvester Stallone in it. That was pretty spectacular for its time, but frankly is okay at best. But I think was definitely better than the new one they made. I mean, you can't do Judge Dredd and not be campy. Yet you gotta be campy. It's a comic book, for crying out loud. So I had the opportunity to work on some of that kind of stuff with Rob, and he would be drawing on one side of his canvas. He would be sketching with his pencil, and as he came across the canvas to the other side, he would grab it from his right hand, he would pass the pencil to his left hand, and keep drawing on the other side of his canvas. And he could do that completely seamlessly, and it blew my mind that he could do that. He could do that with the airbrush, he could do that with any of his paints, he could do that no matter what he was doing. He could pass his medium from one hand to the other and seamlessly paint ambidextrously, and it blew my mind. I'm still in awe of that. But this is the kind of person that Rob Pryor was. I tell you that story because I need to tell you this about Rob Pryor. He came from an artistic family. He learned art at a very early age. He pursued art. He had a passion for it. And that's why he was smart enough when he got to the age that he was looking for a degree to realize that what he needed the most was a business degree and not an art degree. He didn't need training in art. He had all that art training himself. Pardon me. But what he didn't have was an understanding of how to run a business on his own. How, the intricacies of that. And if you are going to do freelance work, get a business degree. You need to understand the intricacies of bidding, of scheduling, of all of those things that a freelance artist needs to do. You will learn with a business degree. And looking back on that now, I can see that. But boy, when it came time for me to go to college, I went late. I spent 10 years trying to be an artist rather than going to school, and ended up working in a shop making drill bits in Houston, and just not having a good time of it. And decided I needed to get back into doing art and went to an art school, and am still in debt from that degree that I cannot shop that degree around. It is useless. But it gave me an experience. There is nothing like sitting in a classroom full of animators and somebody starts tapping their foot to a rhythm or humming something really quietly, and you've got a pretty small room with 20 artists in it, each at their own computer, each just completely engrossed and invested in what they're doing. And before you know it, somebody else picks up that beat or that hum and starts doing something a little different with it. And within moments, you got 5 or 6 people. And before the end of 30 seconds, you've got a full 20 voice orchestra recreating the opening theme song to Power Rangers. That just does not happen in any other degree. Doesn't happen anywhere else. That is, boy, I tell you what, that is animators right there. We would try to stump each other with theme song lyrics. And I cannot think of a single theme song that somebody knew that at least four of the people in the class did not know right away. And I mean, just the opportunities for inside jokes were just amazing. But again, as far as an education goes, wasn't the best. It was a great experience. It was a wonderful experience. I love being around artists, and I need to get back into that again, which is, again, I reiterate, it's why I'm doing this. So, oh, I was telling you about Rob. I was telling you about Rob Pryor. So I asked him one time if he had always been ambidextrous. This was again back in the early '90s because he could pass so easily from one hand to the other, but he would do almost everything else right-handed. All of his art he would do in both hands, but he would do almost everything else right-handed. And I asked him about that one time, and he told me the story. And of course, if you don't know Rob Pryor, he he does tend to um, he likes to tell stories bigger than they are. And I'm not going to say exaggerate, but yeah. and, and I do the same thing. When people ask me a direct question, I think I picked that up from Rob Pryor. When people ask me a question, I will come up with a complete and totally BS answer off the top of my head and just wait and see if they believe it. Because I do that to entertain me. I'm not trying to entertain anybody else. I'm just trying to entertain me. So Rob told me one time, what happened to my video here? Oh, I'm still sketching. It's just really small. So yeah, I'm working on these scales here. Oh, this is a technique. Oh, I love this technique. So for sketching in scales, you saw me go in with the blue pencil underneath and draw in all these hash marks. And now I'm back on the sketch layer and I'm sketching in specific scales now. That's when I picked up from, and it's kind of a bastardization of a technique I learned from Jeff Miracola um, here on YouTube. And he's got some great dragon techniques. Um, and I'm just kind of, like I said, this is a little bit of a mixing different techniques together, and I'm kind of bastardizing his technique a little bit. But you can see how effective it is. I just love how it helps you sketch in exactly where those scales fall, so you don't have to draw in every single scale. You can kind of generalize those scales. Because if you sit there and draw in all the scales, every single last one of them, you are going to have a very, very, very busy drawing. And it's going to take an incredibly long time to accomplish. And the viewer isn't going to look at every single scale. They're going to look generally. So if you draw in every single scale, you're really wasting a lot of time. But if you generalize the scales, well, that's how the viewer sees anyway. So you save yourself a lot of time. You give the impression of the scales. It's like how comic book artists draw buildings. They don't draw every single brick. They draw clumps of bricks, and they generalize bricks. So let me give it. I keep interrupting myself. Let me get back to that story about Rob Pryor. So I asked him about drawing ambidextrously, and he said he learned how to do that. He actually taught himself how to do that because when he was a little kid, he suddenly became terrified that he would break his arm, his drawing arm, and he wouldn't be able to do art ever again. So he spent a year, and this is like before he was even a teenager. He was a little kid. He spent a year doing everything left-handed just so that he could do everything in both hands with an equal amount of dexterity. And it's uh, that it just is a remarkable thing for anybody to do, especially for a little kid. And that tells you how remarkable Rob Pryor is. Uh, I honestly, of the people that I've worked for, of the people that I've worked with, as a mentor, I respect Rob Pryor more than anyone else. Honestly, just as a person and as a professional, he was able to do things that I just cannot fathom. I cannot comprehend doing, but he just did it as a matter of course. So here we go, getting into some back scales, and I'm flicking my sketch on and off just to make sure I'm not skipping areas and mirroring now. Now this is a technique again I learned as a fine artist, and I actually learned it from Rob Pryor. the very first time I learned it. When you're drawing a sketch, when I was drawing a sketch in his art studio, he had me pick up my drawing and go into the bathroom and hold it up to the mirror. And the reason for that is when you hold it up to the mirror, you see it in reverse, you actually see the drawing completely differently than you were while you were drawing it. And it actually fools your brain. It tricks your brain into seeing it with completely fresh eyes. Even though your conscious mind knows you're seeing the same drawing, when you flick it to a mirror pose, or even hold it up in a physical mirror if you're doing something on paper, you trick your brain into seeing it completely fresh. And you can see the flaws, you can see um, much easier how things are in proportion to each other. But here we go. Redraw. Oh yeah, I'm redrawing some of the on the sketch layer. I'm sketching in those hash marks that are going to help me place scales later. Now keep in mind this is at a 600% speed, and it still looks incredibly slow. While I was drawing this, it does take a very, very long time. Fine art takes patience, whether you're doing it digitally or uh, doing it on a physical canvas, a piece of paper with a pencil, if you're using traditional materials or not. You need to take the time to really sketch out and think through your drawings and plan things. So here I am sketching in a wing, and I'm sketching right over the body. I did not sketch the wings in at first, but I had always planned to have wings on this particular dragon. And I really wanted to draw a dragon for my very, very first speed painting, because even though I do plan on doing a lot of fan art, and you'll see me do things from different shows, just to have the experience of drawing those. But I really wanted to do something that wasn't related to a show, that wasn't fan related, that was a completely original composition for me to do. And I chose this dragon because my channel's name is RamDragon. Now, I've used that name. I have used the name RamDragon since, oh, I don't even know, 1994 maybe, perhaps probably 1993. Um, while I was working at the Rob Pryor studio as an apprentice, he was mentoring me in airbrush and in being a fine artist, and I greatly am incredibly grateful to him for that, for allowing me to do that. But it wasn't a job that really paid the bills. So I had a job working in an engineering firm, and I know most people are in high school at this time, and I was homeschooled during that period of time. So hey, I was able to work during the day. I was between the ages of 15 and 17 at the time. And what my job was is I would go into this engineering firm every morning, and I would comb through hundreds of thousands of files every single day and weed out iterative files. And for anybody who's worked on Unix, you know what I'm talking about. This was a Unix system. This was a Unix server. And in an engineering firm, what that means, I think Macs do the same thing, but not on not nearly as bad. But what would happen is if you create a file in a Unix system and you open that file up and make a change to it and save it down again, it will not save over the original file. You will actually have your file name underscore, or no, you'll have your file name dot extension dot 001 on the second file. And then the third file will be 002 and on and on and on. So it creates, rather than overwriting the original file, it creates an iterative file system. So if you go into look for, let's say, bugbear.jpg, and you open up bugbear.jpg, it's actually going to open up the most recent iteration of bugbear.jpg, and then when you change it and save it, it's going to create a whole new iteration. Now, what this means in engineering at the time, they were just transferring over, or they had just finished, I should say. When I started working there, they had just finished transferring over to an all-new computer system from desks and paper. I mean, this was a Stone Age place in the early 90s, and going to computer-aided engineering was really new in the industry. And they had just finished that transfer over. Everything was on computers at that point, and these engineers had only been using these computers for about 2 or 3 years. They were brand new. They were still learning a lot of things about infrastructure, about IT. And one of the things they didn't realize is how much space these files were going to take up. So in an engineering firm, they're making mechanical products that have many hundreds of gears in them. And you open up a file that has an engineered assembly, and open up a subassembly, and open up a subassembly inside that subassembly just to get at a part and change that part. Well, now you've created 4 separate iteration files. You've created your part iteration, your subassembly iteration, your second level subassembly iteration, and your final assembly iteration, all just from trying to open up and save one part. And these engineers were not, they were still figuring out how to get around that. And if you go into an engineering firm now that does the same thing, what you'll find is they do not open final product files. They go and find the part file directly so that when they change it and it creates an iteration, all of the subassemblies that reference that iteration will update automatically to the new iteration. So you're not creating 100 copies of one file every time you open something up, which is exactly what these guys were doing in the early 90s. So it used up all their server space, and my job was to go in and delete all of the old iterations and everything but the newest iteration. And yes, there was a lot of work lost because you've got multiple engineers working on different parts, different subassemblies of the same final product at the same time. So you're getting, some of the times you'll get a part that has some updates, and other times you'll open up a file and it'll have other updates, and it just depended on who saved and closed last. So a lot of updated files were getting lost anyway at the time. And just to alleviate the problem and alleviate the space, my job was to go in and clean up the server space. And it was a tremendous amount of fun. It was great fun, and that's what I did to pay the bills. But during that time is where I first got interested in art. I was able to play with some of the engineering programs. At the time, they were using Pro Engineer, which is now Creo, and I have used Creo recently. But I would go in, and when I had time, I would play with these engineering programs. But instead of creating parts, I think I did. I took a speaker off my desk and I measured it out and I recreated it inside of Pro Engineer just to see if I could. And I learned things like arrays. I made the grill mesh off the front. But what I really liked doing was trying to recreate my video game characters in the engineering program so it would look 3D. And I wanted to do it at a very high level of sophistication. It just wasn't possible at the time. There was no such thing as organic modeling. But during the time that I worked there, somebody on the floor got a hold of an early release copy of Autodesk 3D Studio. Now, Autodesk still is a leader in the CAD industry, the computer aided design industry. And they really wanted to do something a little bit different than everybody else. So this was their first, Autodesk Studio was kind of their first attempt at that. And boy, I spent hours and hours. I'd went in on the weekends just to play with the Autodesk Studio and make these little animations. And that's what it was really designed for. And Maya was brand new at the time. Maya had some groundbreaking reverse kinesthetic that they had implemented in their rigging system. And it was a tremendous amount of fun to learn that. And that's one of the reasons why, when I decided to go to school, I really wanted to get into animation, because my early experiences with art, my early experiences with animation, I really wanted to get in and make video games. That was my ultimate goal. And unfortunately, I never was really able to see that through. And that was because I kept getting too distracted by, the day-to-day minutia of life, paying the bills and getting into a position where I could do art. But in order to do that, I was eschewing art. So what I'm doing here, I'm sure you've seen other speed paint artists who do this, and my technique is a little bit different from theirs. You saw me go in and I generalized the color layer and use some very, very basic colors. I am going a little bit darker than what I want the final product to look on all of my colors. And the reason for that is um, you you kind of want to have it closer to the shadow side. Um, and now that I'm looking at it play through again, I don't believe I went through and lightened it up. I think I actually ended up making it darker even than this. So yeah, I just kind of flooded the whole area with color. And there's a much better way to do this that I've seen other artists use, and it's not a technique that I'm super accustomed to doing, and that's just creating a lasso around your area and then using the flood tool to fill in the color. And it's much, much faster and more precise. But this is the technique that I was really taught in my very first experience with Photoshop in the early 2000s when I first went back to school to earn an art degree. Um, at the time, it was just called Photoshop 3. It was a very early iteration of Adobe's uh, art tool. And this is how I would color everything. I would just flood it in, and then I would go around and erase what fell outside the lines. And it does take time. It takes a lot of time. And you'll see me doing this for a while. And again, at 600%, it doesn't look like it's that bad. But yeah, it's that bad. And on Krita, which is relatively new to me, and trying to relearn how to use that brush, this process did really take quite a long time, quite a lot longer than I wanted it to take. I really wanted to have a video out last Friday so that I could keep on a regular schedule. But as you can see, this video took a little bit longer to create than I really would have wanted it to. And so as a result, it took a lot more time to put together and edit, um, get the final product out the door. I worked on this for 2 or 3 hours a day over a period of 4 days. And like I said, the final drawing I think only took about 6 hours. But my final count on the video was a little over 8 hours. I think it was approaching 8.5 hours, and I had a period in there. Here's my second break. It's 2:30 a.m. It's time to break. Definitely time to break. Um, when I came back the next day, returned from my break. Oh, it wasn't the next day. It was 2 days later. Look at that. I'm glad I made a note on there so I would remember. But yeah, it took a little time to get to where I was going with this. I wasn't able to work on it as regularly as I wanted, and the overall project, took a lot longer than I expected. So um, on this part, I'm going to finish erasing my sketched in color layer and really refining uh, where that color goes. And what this allows me to do is use a general selection tool, um, a I believe it's called non-contiguous color selection, where you can select a color and it will select all of the pixels with that color on it on the entire layer, and use that to make my masks that I would then color in the shadows and highlights. So here, just trying to go as fast as I can and be as specific as I can to erase the outlines and if being efficient. And that was That's really what's wrong with this technique is it's not a super efficient technique. You can only be as efficient as you can. I mean, I don't know what that's not true for, but probably put that on a shirt someday. You can only be as efficient as you can. Uh, Trying to refine some of my outline layer here, going between the different layers. And that's what's really important with this cleanup job is remembering which layer your sketches are on, which layer your drawing is on, which layer your colors are on. And I put all of my colors on one layer, and I think next time I'm not going to do that. I'm going to have my colors on separate layers. And that's going to help a lot with the cleanup speed. I just have to erase around each color separately rather than going back and forth between the different colors and making sure that everything's right. So here I've used my non-contiguous color selection layer to select all of the red. And you can see my color palette off to the right. It's got the outline around it as well. And that's why it does, because I use the non-contiguous color selection. And the reason I use the non-contiguous color selection is because I can then go through and create my shadows on all of one color at one time and not have to go between colors. Now, my biggest weakness with any kind of fine art is I'm colorblind. Just a little bit, not much. I am red and green colorblind. So when I pick colors, I do like using, you can see my color wheel up in the right. The upper right is is changed from the default of Krita. I've changed it to look a little bit more like the selection wheel in Photoshop. And the reason for that is because I'm a little more comfortable with it. I can see where on the color wheel red, green, and blue lie. As a result, I know where yellow, orange, and purple are. And I can get into selecting colors based on generalized understanding of the color wheel rather than being able to see exactly where my color is. Um, so browns, skin tones particularly are difficult for me. Uh, when I get into some shades of blues and purples, they get confused and muddled together. I can rarely see the difference between light greens and yellows, which is really frustrating. But this color wheel lets me do that. So, and that's one of the reasons why I like to shade one color at a time, because I don't have to go between colors. I don't have to keep trying to remember which color I selected. And that's why I created that color palette off on the right of my drawing, so that I can see the base colors. I can pick them out at the beginning of the drawing. I can pick them out right away. I know which reds I'm going to choose to color all of my red parts. I know which blues I'm going to use to color all of my blue parts. And I think I've got a row of browns there too for the horns and the fins and the scales. So, and I picked all of those first so that I wouldn't have to worry about it later. And you saw me fiddle a little bit with the shadow layer and how it would mix with the layers below it. And the reason is because I've done this in Photoshop. I had a reasonably good idea of how I was going to do it in Photoshop. And I just needed to make sure that Krita was going to allow me to do it the same way. So what I'm doing is, you saw me just look at my shadow layer. I only used black, and I did not use it fully. I used the airbrush tool. Because with the airbrush tool, I'm very familiar, let me try speaking that in English. I'm very familiar with how the airbrush tool works, so I was very comfortable using it in shading my shadow areas. And I'm able to go over the same area again and again and again to darken it up, rather than like with any kind of brush or pen tool, it will be as dark as its selection when I start. And I know there are some brushes in Krita that let you select the opacity by the pen pressure, but I really like to leave my brush size related to my pen pressure. I'm a lot more familiar with that setup. Now, and this does have to do with habit. Again, old habits that I am recreating, redeveloping. And with the new capabilities in Krita, I probably should be trying to develop new and different techniques, new and different habits. But I didn't think of that at the time. I think the next one I will try. I know it's correct, but it sounds odd. I will be trying out different techniques than I am truly accustomed to. And now you can see one of the biggest, right there under the jaw, right above the neck. You can see one of the biggest weaknesses with my cleanup technique is you miss areas. You can't really see them a lot of times. They're partially transparent, but it is a color area. And when you use the flood tool, when you create the lasso tool and then flood the area, you're really able to specify. You can follow right along with your pen lines and create a lasso right on your outline. And it's a lot more specific, and there's no spillover, and there's very little cleanup afterwards, and you just don't get this effect. Those little leftover bits that you can only see when you select the contiguous color tool. So what I'm doing now is I've got this very, very, very dark area that's right underneath the body of the dragon there, and I want to make sure that's super, super dark. Not black, different than black, just super, super dark. And I've been kind of watching along as I'm rambling. I believe I am now using a dark red color instead of black. And one of the reasons is when you use a multiply layer, it will change how the color blends with the colors below it. And when you use black to create a shadow on a multiply layer, it turns that color more towards black and will eventually be black. And I learned this when airbrushing. You don't want to use black to shade. You really want to use a complement of that color to shade, because as it blends in, it pulls it to a more natural tone, a more neutral tone. So going back and doing this again, I would have been careful not to select black to color the shadow layer of my dragon. I would have probably picked a, let's see, a yellow, a really, really, really dark yellow, probably almost a green, to create that shadow layer with. Not quite all the way to green, but definitely much closer to maybe actually closer to purple now that I'm thinking about it, to create that shadow layer. And I did, when I cleaned up a little bit towards the end, I did select a purple to go in on these scales and create some more shadows. But what I'm doing now is I've got the generalized layer of shadow down, and I'm shadowing the scales themselves. And this is where the pen pressure really comes into its own. It becomes its own game changer right there, because I can go into an area like these wings that are going to have a thinner shadow towards the joint and thicker shadow towards the middle of the joint, where the skin flap is going to sag more. And I can really color in those shadows very carefully, very specifically. And what I'm doing here is I'm trying to clean up something for my shadow layer that spilled over. And this is why it's not good to have those little bits of color left over. When you use the contiguous color layer, the contiguous color selector rather, and then go to a different layer in color, those little bits of transparent color then pick up the shadow. And even though it's on multiply, and multiply white will always turn to white, multiply black will always turn to black, it does create a little bit of a mess later on to clean up. So I'm just trying to get these bits cleaned up. And you did see there, when I switched off my color layer to see only my outline layer, I did make a mistake. I did some of my shadow coloring on the outline layer. And it looked good, so I left it. It was all right. So I did leave it behind. Since my color layer is a multiply of my outline layer, and I use some of those purples and some of those blacks to create the shadow on the outline layer, it kind of has the same effect as creating that that same layer over the color layer. There are some minor differences that didn't really come into effect in this application, so I didn't bother changing it. But just be aware, and cleaning up once you color on your line layer, that's super hard to clean up. If you don't notice it right away, you're going to have to basically start over. And I didn't want to do that on this. I wanted to take my mistake, even everything that I did, to completion, to an end. So here's my color layer with the lines turned off. And one of the reasons why I do that is I have a very painterly style, in case you haven't noticed. A lot of the techniques and tricks that I've learned over the years, I've learned by painting real paintings. And while I haven't done very many of them, uh, I do still have those techniques in store, in my mind, in the back of my brain. So I go right back to them. I pick them right back up where I was. And what I'm doing here, yeah, I've selected the blue scales. I'm just creating those shadows the same way that I did on the body, the exact same way. It's the exact same technique, except that I believe I've selected a dark blue. Yeah, I can see it right there. I've selected a dark blue color instead of black. And I think I kind of stayed that way through this whole process of this part. And looking back now, I probably would have gone back and selected a darker yet color, much closer to black, to get right in under that armpit and create a darker contrast there. But here I am, I'm using a complement color to try to uh, affect the shadow a little bit more. And what I ended up doing, you'll see in a moment, is I ended up deciding I really wanted those scales to be golden. So I colored them in kind of a muted yellow color. Here you can see, and in a little while you'll see me pick, there it is, I picked a different color altogether, made it much more opaque, and I am just coloring those in flat on my flat color layer. That's kind of an orangey yellow, isn't it? That's hard for me to see looking back on it now. I've got a smaller screen that I'm watching this play back on than my Krita was. My Krita's on my big monitor. I should probably just move this over and and watch it on the same monitor I painted it on. So there we go. I've got that all in, and you can see my shadow layer, I turned it back on, and it affects that flat color layer, even though I changed the colors on there. And it's just a beautiful mix there, how that affects even the colored scales. Um, and now I'm going back in my shadow layer, and I'm refining how those shadows affect those scales individually rather than generally. It's the same thing that I did on the body. I did a lot of general colors, and then I went into the scales and I created shadows, yet more shadows. And I'd like to skip ahead. I keep thinking to myself, I'd like to skip ahead. But watching this technique, watching the whole speed paint, you can really get a better feel towards techniques and practices that I use. And as I do more, you'll see my techniques change over time. I really enjoy learning new tactics, especially when it comes to art. I love trying things that I have never done before, and especially in drawing, particularly in drawing, because I can go in and if I draw something in a completely new and different way, then I can go back and I can see some of my old drawings and I say to myself, man, I wish I would have known this technique. I would have used it on this drawing or that drawing. One of the first times I realized that is, again, when I was working at Rob Pryor's studio, um, which I don't even remember what he called it at the time, but when I was working in his art studio, he started working on a comic book, and it was a reprint of Stargazer, Starslayer, reprint of Starslayer. That's what it was. And I got to work on some of the background coloring, and I am colorblind. I have a weakness with color, but working in his studio, I learned that as I'm exposed to color more, I can start to think better in color. And after right now, as I am, 10 years of not doing art very often, not doing art with any kind of regularity, my color selection skills, my ability to see color has kind of suffered over time, and unfortunately. So here I am using that lasso tool that I was talking about. But working on Stargazer, I got an interest in drawing more comic book style. And I was actually introduced to Rob Pryor because I had taken a comic book drawing class that his business partner was involved in. And Rob Pryor came down, and his business partner did a lot of traveling, went to cons constantly. That was his primary business model. Um, so Rob came in and sat in on the class a few times, and that's how I met Rob. But I started drawing these comic book characters, and Rob says to me, he goes, "Why do you always make your arms so long?" And I look back and I pull out those old drawings, and boy, the hair on the back of my neck stands up because my arms are ape-like. They're just long. They're not muscular. I mean, no more muscular than other comic book characters at the time, normal comic book characters. I should say normal, but it was definitely better than some professional comic book artists that will go unnamed from the 90s, Rob Liefeld. But it wasn't it wasn't really a tightly assembled capability. I didn't understand how to draw structure. And one of the reasons for that is when people first learn to draw as a child, they'll draw the head, and the head is a circle, and they'll draw the body, and the body is another circle. Maybe it's kind of a long circle, or it's a squished circle, or something like that. But they draw these outlines of their people, and they do one part at a time. And that's what I was doing, even as a teenager, as a very good artist as a teenager. I was still doing that. I would draw the body, and then I would draw the head, and then I would draw the arms. And as a result, my proportions were just terrible. I never had any capacity for proportion at the time. And I was introduced to drawing comics the Marvel way and how to draw the DC way, or something like that. I can't remember the specific titles. But I used those books to get some real, much better layout techniques for drawing form over a structure. And I would create that structure. And I was just fascinated with the process. I would draw the structure, and I could draw the structure very, very quickly. I could draw it uh, within a few minutes. I could draw a good structure, and then I would draw my character over the structure. And it was a much better technique. I could draw faster overall rather than slower, even though I added this whole extra step in. Because I wasn't constantly drawing something and erasing it and drawing it again and erasing it and drawing it a third time and over and over and over and over as I had been. But structure is definitely the primary part. And you saw at the very beginning of this, when I drew my dragon, I had that circle for the head, and I drew in the snout, the muzzle, but then I started doing the outline of the neck and the body, rather than doing like a peanut shape like Disney does for the body, or tubes for the arm. But if you go back and look, that's exactly what I was doing. I was kind of drawing an outline of the neck, because the neck is just a big long tube. And on a dragon body, it's not really a bean shape or a peanut shape. It's actually kind of a misshapen tube. So I drew that in, and then with the legs, I sketched out the outlines of blobs, because in my head, I can see the structure of the bone. I can see the structure of the muscle. And when you're first learning to draw, you have to draw those things out. You just have to. And eventually you get to the point where you can kind of see them in your head, and you don't have to sketch so much of them out. But I still will. And when I did that first arm, that front arm, you saw that I sketched in a little bit of yeah, that was actually a layer test to see how the color would blend for my highlight layer. And I turned down the opacity tremendously because of that. And I'm just putting in splashes of highlight on the scales themselves. But what I did is I drew in like a shape for the deltoid, and then I kind of created a misshapen tube for the upper arm and another misshapen tube for the lower arm. Sketched in a sideways block for the hand or the palm, the paw area. I don't even know what you would call it on a dragon. I draw hands on dragons, so I'll call it a hand. And then you could see how I was sketching in those forms, but I didn't so much on the back leg because I wanted this kind of cat-like misshapen blob that really obscures the anatomy of the leg, like a back leg of a cat that's sitting in that position. But in order to do that, you have to understand the anatomy of a cat leg, and I do. Well, I shouldn't say I understand it. I'm not a vet or anything, but I've studied enough of it over the years that I can see that in my head, and I was able to go, well, this part is a hip, this part is a knee, this part is a femur, and just go in and sketch what would have been outside of that. And I go back again to those early drawings and I can see what it was like to draw without any understanding of that sketching of that structure layer. And it's totally, totally different. And once I started doing that, another one of the people that was working in Rob's studio, he had a completely different structure system. He called it bubble muscles. And he would go in and he would draw these big bubbles for all of the muscles, and he would build this form, a bubble at a time. And he made a really, really great looking character, but I could never understand that technique. And I practiced it for years and for years. And the problem with that technique is you don't have the structure. Human bodies are hung from bones. Dragon bodies are hung from bones. You got to kind of know what those bones look like. And I'd say kind of know generally what those bones look like. Most artists have anatomy references in their studios at all times. Muscle charts, bone charts, and even nude body references that they can go, I'm looking for this kind of a pose for a leg, and they can flip through them and go, here's one, and they have the whole leg there lighted a certain way, and they can say, that's exactly what I'm looking for, and use that as a reference. And you need to have those things as a fine artist. And it works for animals, it works for humans, it works for inanimate objects, cars, pencils. I mean, just anything that you're going to be drawing have picture references of. But you have to understand the structure. Well, not so much on like toys and cars and stuff, because those are hard body uh, objects. But definitely on organic objects, you need to have an understanding of the structure, where muscle hangs from bone, where skin hangs from muscle, where skin is stretched tight by muscle. And the bubble muscle technique didn't have any of that. But I can see back in my mind's eye where that kid was sketching using this bubble muscle technique, and he was probably actually copying Rob Liefeld, who had zero understanding of anatomy. But this kid definitely had a very solid understanding of anatomy. So he could start with a pectoral muscle at a side view, and he could draw in what the other pectoral muscle looked like, partially obscured by that front pectoral muscle, and then go move into the abs and the front, the side that's facing the drawing and the side that's kind of tucked in behind, and then all of the solar plexus muscles. And then as you'd work up towards the arm, you'd get into the deltoids and the trapezius and, the biceps and triceps and all the different muscles in the forearms. But he understood how those muscles were strung to the skeletons. So as he drew, he still, in his mind, kept track of a structure, even though he didn't sketch out that structure. And that's one of the reasons why I could never really fully understand the bubble technique, but I implement it in my drawings now today. When I draw human characters, I always start with a bone-like stretch. It's almost a stick figure with circles for joints. And then I will bubble in muscle and anatomy over that. And not really this to the same degree that he did. I won't draw a whole bubble for a whole muscle group. I will draw in, the part of the muscle that goes over what it's obscuring. So kind of a mix between a an outline and a bubble, and using a structure technique that I learned partially from drawing comics the Marvel way. I learned partially from a class I took as a young boy from a Disney artist who had actually worked on uh, what movie did he work on? It's suddenly blocked out of my mind. Dumbo. He had worked on Dumbo. Um, but I mean, that was like a one-off class out of like a Michaels or something. It wasn't anything official. It wasn't a Disney-related training class. And I don't know, I was probably 12 or 13 when I took that class. But I learned, I've been collecting techniques since then that I still apply today. And you can see I'm doing the exact same thing to the background that I did to the foreground with the main character, the dragon. With the main difference being that I'm trying a different variety of brushes in order to get different techniques and effects. I wanted to have kind of like a gold bed, even though in my mind, my RamDragon isn't a true dragon. um, and doesn't really have an interest in gold. I really wanted to have a dragon sitting on a pile of gold. And yes, I just enjoy drawing ram horns. That's kind of my thing, I suppose. But I mean, you can see my icon for the channel is basically just a cartoon version of me with ram horns, and in my mind's eye, that's exactly what a ram dragon is. It's just a dude with ram horns. I've actually role-played him in forums before. I introduced my RamDragon character to a forum that was basically full of supernatural and superhero and uh, technology-based superhumans of all sorts of different kinds of, people who wielded magic like we would wield the buttons on our shirts, and I introduced my RamDragon character, and they're like, "Oh, what does he do?" And I described him as being partially fire retardant. So that was his big special ability, is he was slightly less flammable than normal humans. So again, I've picked out a light source, and it's the same light source that I had in mind while I was sketching the dragon. And this is why um, on this drawing I sketched out my background first, because that was going to really dictate where my light source came from. And even though it wasn't up while I was drawing the shadows and highlights of my dragon, I had that in mind while I was creating the shadows and highlights. Now I'm in trouble. I've got all those multiply layers of color, of shadow, of highlight, and when I turn on my background, they they show through. But I need to have my dragon up in order to draw his shadow on top of the gold piles. And here we go. We're getting more and more specific down here. And it's again more specific shadows on the gold piles as well. And man, how far are we into this? We're almost to the end of this drawing. Okay, good. Wrong color for those shadows. More brushes, different brushes for those shadows, and just trying to create separate piles now that I've sketched in. I've sketched in all these big piles of gold, and now I want little tiny piles to be picked out on top of those bigger piles to make them kind of all blend together. And now I realized one side of the cavern is going to have a lot less light than the other side, so I created a big shadow over, knocking back the brightest points on the right side, and then going back in and creating kind of reflective bounce back shadow for everything else. And finally, this pillar, I created the shadow on top of the round pillar by creating a mask, a selectionary. I used a selectionary as a mask to color in that pillar, and now I'm doing the same thing to do the facets on the base of this pillar. And what I'm doing is I'm even doing the colors, yes, behind the gold. And the reason for that is because even though it's on the same layer, and now looking back, even at that time that I was coloring it, and I finished this drawing yesterday, but I realized as I was doing it that I really should have had the room and the gold on separate layers as well, so that I could create a much better overlap. And as I'm picking in these shadows, I'm kind of realizing that my upper shadows aren't quite right. And I'm just going through and fixing those. And again, different brushes to get stone-like finishes and gold-like finishes. I'm using the same brush I used before to sketch back in that layer, that pile of gold that went in front of the pillar. And I've actually got this, I want it to look like it was leaning against that, against that pillar. So I've got it kind of wrapped up and then leaned against the top of that facet. And again, the highlight points are a lot less bright than the highlight points on the left, where it's in more direct sunlight there. And darker shadows on the right than on the left, that was important too. Now, darker shadows also means smaller shadows. So even though I say darker shadows on the right, you saw I put in the darker shadows on the left as well, but those shadows were much smaller because the coins are exposed to more light. The light covers more of, in a pile of gold, the light would cover more of the exposed coin, leaving less area for shadow. And now I'm just using my color layer, selecting the white area of my color layer and inverting the selection. That gives me my dragon selection. Pardon me. And now I'm seeing that there are some problems with the highlight layer that I'm erasing. But by selecting my color layer, the white area of my color layer, and then inverting it, I had a dragon-shaped image that I could then delete out of my background layer. And here I am signing it, 2018, by RamDragon. There we are. Thank you very much for joining me for this speed paint. I hope you have a great day. I hope you have a great day? That's not what I should say. I should say something astounding. I should say something incredible like, now go out there and draw something. Go out there and draw your dragon. Draw your dragon, slay your dragon? I don't know. You know what? I'm just going to say, do your thing. Have fun. Thank you for joining me. This is RamDragon signing out.